So we are going to be taking a look at the interesting case of Breana Noojin Nix. It's a murder investigation. It's never been solved, and a couple of very key important points will be covered about this case. I find it strange that after more than a decade, you know, in some of these cases, and including in this recent Breana Noojin Nix case, they're starting to finally, examine the fact that there's an accomplice most likely involved. And Stephen Nix is widely believed to be the main suspect, and I kind of hold to that course. But there's someone else who was involved in probably all of these cases, and so we're going to be looking at that, examining that in more depth here. Thank you again. So right now we're going to be studying the sudden and terrible murder of Breana Noojin Nix. There was also another victim who happened in the same area. But it says when Breana Noojin Nix was found dead in her bathroom in March 2020, her husband, Stephen Nix, had an explanation. But Stephen's stories were full of holes. He suggested that his wife died of an accidental overdose. But now we know, looking from the police report and the other investigative report that came shortly after, that this was, of course, untrue. The department had a history for being more of a good old boys club. Nearly 2 years after losing her sister, Brittany continues to fight for justice for Breana Noojin Nix, as authorities try to sweep it out of the news. So this is very interesting because this particular true crime case has a lot of connections to several other important true crime cases, including the Barry Morphew case, and it has some interesting similarities as well with the Chandler Halderson murder case. We're going to be examining that in a bit. We're going to be examining some of the similarities that the psychological profile has in the case of Chandler Halderson and one other individual as well.
Other than a little bit of blood on her arm where she had injected a needle, and then a couple of drops of blood in the sink store, and had her phone deactivated and had her number transferred over to a little burner phone that he had.
So anyway, folks, the bottom line here is the Breana Noojin Nix case has been a little bit complex at certain points. And when it went to the grand jury, here's one of the things that they were discussing. It didn't get too much press for some reason. I'll double check the docket. You're saying it was because Breana Noojin Nix witnessed a murder that they closed the case? And said yes. And again, I have studied this quite a bit, studied it kind of back and forth. There was fentanyl, seen at the crime scene, but there were also these needles, and the fingerprints on the actual needles themselves appear to belong to Stephen Nix. So I'm convinced at this point that Stephen Nix was most likely the perpetrator of the crime, and that Stephen Nix had an accomplice, somebody who was higher up in the Alabama state government. From what I've been able to gather, that means it was somebody who's connected with the state authorities, including the DA. Now, they didn't handle this case very well, and the person that was attempting to help Breana's sister reopen it did not really look into this case in the correct manner. But the reason that I'm going over this is it's very important to document here that the caucus jury that was formed did not explore the allegations of Nix witnessing a additional murder. And so now it's understood that that's one of the main reasons that it has to be looked at through a very clear lens by someone else, for sure. Because of the fact that Nix may have witnessed this murder that's apparently directly tied to Stephen Nix. So I maintain the fact that Stephen Nix is the suspect, meaning the one who definitely murdered Breana Noojin Nix, but he has an accomplice. And this accomplice is what needs to be explored and really given some careful thought, because that accomplice who was working in the, higher office of the state government is who needs to be convicted. So there needs to be more coverage of this case, a lot more coverage, I would say, on podcasts and similar, and less accusations just thrown out without evidence, because the people who have been opening this case and attempting to open it are not exploring the allegations about the fact that Brittany is telling the truth here about a murder that was witnessed by her sister, Breana Noojin Nix. And that's where you have to start, is what happened there. Who else was witness, possibly, to this murder? Even though the credibility of one of the witnesses would be in question regardless, there's been enough of a ruckus made about the accusation that Breana Noojin Nix witnessed a murder, that's the first place you have to start. And so that's why this investigation, I strongly feel, has to be started over. And we need to have a full impaneling of a outside jury and others exploring these murders that Breana Noojin Nix possibly witnessed and what Stephen Nix was doing on the same days that these murders were said to have happened. Because the number one thing is they need to examine the accusation of the murder much more seriously, and they need to look at the fact of the timeline. And there was, as some others have said, there was a bloody cloth, some kind of cloth or something, some fabric that had blood on it, and that needs to be examined and taken back to determine whether this murder that was, witnessed and similar issues around the actual murder, determine whether that occurred in the same exact venue, meaning the same town that Breana Noojin Nix lives in. Did it occur in the same area? And so on. I think just going back to that key accusation would get whoever it was that was in charge of this, meaning the DA or anyone who was involved in that specific area, I think it would get them permanently booted out. And I think it would get everybody a much clearer picture of what's going on. I've said it since the beginning. They need to explore that accusation about both of the Nix family having witnessed a possible murder. They need to take it very seriously, examine the evidence, and see if there is indeed another uh, victim. Someone else that Stephen Nix may have been connected to for some reason. Someone else that was killed. That's the bottom line. And that's the only way that this case is going to be fully resolved. That's my take on it. There's a few more issues I want to cover about the psychology of the profile of Stephen Nix and the accomplice. So hold on right there. Thank you. And so when I point out that it's clear and obvious that someone else was in fact involved with the Nix murder, I'm pointing out that it's 100% obvious at this point. And Gavin Fish has done a lot of great work on this as well, so I don't at all want to set that aside in any way. But there are some things here that we all need to be looking at quite a bit deeper. And this is what it talks about that happened in 1995. Nicole Smith was walking to school with her sister on June 7, 1995, but forgot something. Authorities did not reveal the suspect's name, who basically found her in the woods and confronted her at the news conference, but identified him as 49-year-old Kelvin Arnold. Despite identifying a suspect after 2 decades, it's too late for justice because Arnold died August 29th. The police department said they were finding assignment and never gave up on the cold case itself. After Smith's death, the Atlanta Police Department interviewed hundreds of people and took blood samples from at least 50. A DNA profile was obtained in the process. It means Nicole's killer is back. Velasquez retired in 2017. Demester said that with the help of outside genealogy and ancestral databases, it took about 3 years to develop Kelvin Arnold as a person of interest and suspect. So he was involved in the rape and murder, essentially, of Aquinelia Smith and a few other victims, and he was connected to kind of just a shady, not good church group, as a lot of these are. And it is a shady church group who actually killed someone else, which I'll cover later. But what happened here, is very predictable because his DNA profile was found there. And then I'm just going to show you this. This is very important here. His direct cousin was found and arrested in Blount County, Alabama. This is the same place where Breana Noojin Nix ends up being murdered. Okay? Pay attention to this fact. And he was arrested at a Gunnersville police department. And if that wasn't enough, Arnold, this means the cousin of Clyde or Kelvin Arnold, also was in the state investigator's office. So that explains some things. Then we see here that this is definitely no game. We've got Peter Arnold, we've got Alexis Arnold, of course, but we've got Scott Arnold, Ben Arnold, Zachary Arnold, and all of the rest of the group, including Zara Arnold and Neil Arnold. They are inside the Craig. Small world. That's right. And so that's proof, circumstantial proof at this point, because there's going to need to be some real forensics, a new investigation in forensics, but it's proof that Arnold was involved with Stephen Nix. And so he may have been indeed the accomplice, very likely, who murdered Breana Noojin Nix. So someone else working there in the state investigator's office is related to Arnold and so on. And it's very likely, because it kept popping up, it's very likely that Clyde Arnold was there. We can't discount that fact. that he was involved with this in some form. So that's where I wanted to point out. And the profile for Mr. Arnold, both members of the Arnold family, is very similar to that of Chandler Halderson. So I wanted to get to that for a second. The Chandler Halderson psychological profile is important to make direct note of, because that profile is essentially a psychopath. So Chandler Halderson was not like just a grandiose narcissist like we usually run into. He was a psychopath, and what that means is they had no kind of feeling about leaving, for example, a bloody cloth or bloody rag as well in the crime scene, or for cutting up the actual victim into pieces. And it says one of the Arnolds has been convicted before for essentially cutting someone. Nearly cutting them up, in other words. And this is a very important psychological profile, because it tells us that the psychopath, the sociopathic psychopath, has a very, very different regard for its victims, or for people in general, than just the common narcissist or the common type of criminal mindset has. And the way Breana Noojin Nix's body was found, kind of crumpled on the floor, matches the profile for indeed a psychopath being involved in the crime scene. This is why it's so important to get the word out and get the official investigation report released. Thank you again. We will be covering more. This is one of those very unsound church groups that was discussed. It's linked kind of to Arnold. And it's definitely linked to Stephen Nix. Anyway, it's just another victim who's out there who's been, unfortunately, taken down by this kind of the Remnant Fellowship Church is what they call it. Joseph Smith, who succumbed to brutal stabbing wounds, apparently injuries that were put into him by this group. So there was that, and there was Jennifer Lee Daughtry, who basically was murdered by the same people associated with this. The Greensburg Six were led by the close friend of Jennifer Daughtry, who tortured the victim for 2 days. So anyway, just a little bit on that. These folks were linked to the people who essentially killed Elaine Park, and the same suspects who murdered Breana Noojin Nix. So Stephen Nix was linked to that kind of strange church for some reason. And that was never really explained either. Stephen's uncle is a deputy at the Hayden Police Department, which is a good old boy network. 2 years after losing the sister, Brittany continues to fight for justice. So, just interesting. Thank you again. Like, comment, subscribe.